this case, there is an item which values to help relax you and maybe cure some of that insomnia tonight. If you're not trying to go to sleep, just something to calm your mind. Any guesses on what is in the Wide Awake Attaché Case? Suppose if you saw the title and you're aware of what's in the case, there would be no guessing necessary. But on the chance that you too, like let's get lucky, maybe the contents of this case are still a mystery to you. This is not a very thick book. However, I don't see us finishing the entire story. But since it's an anthology, there will be natural places to pause. And we can just come back and pick up. If you want to. Like I said, we're reading scary, stories for Stormy Nights. It's by R.C. Welch, and the illustrations are by Bernard Custodio. So we can thank Bernard Custodio for this lovely werewolf image. Story 1, The Shape of Things. As far as Glenn was concerned, moving into the new housing development built in the foothills outside of town was a great move. He still saw all his old friends at school, and he got to make a lot of new friends too. Forested hills, sparkling streams, and green meadows were the best backyard he could have hoped for. And he and Dolph, his two German shepherds, spent as much time as they could exploring the unknown countryside. Now, out with Dolph, about to embark on another exploration, Glenn reached the wooden fence that separated the asphalt pavement from a dirt service road leading into the hills. He wriggled through the fence, and Dolph eagerly followed. Then, once they were safe from any traffic, Glenn took Dolph off the leash. Happy to be free, the dog raced into the tall grass of a nearby field as Glenn sauntered along the road. Glenn had already decided that today he and Dolph would probe deeper into a narrow canyon they had found last weekend. The walls of the hills were so close together and covered so thickly with brush that it looked nearly impossible to enter the small gap. But Glenn had found a narrow trail, almost invisible in the brush, and he wanted to see where it led. Keeping an eye on Dolph to make sure he didn't wander too far, Glenn conjured up images of hidden treasures and old native camps tucked away in the sheltered ravine. Who knew what he'd find there? Why, he might even come across an ancient civilization. The weekend before, Glenn had made sure to carefully memorize the area around the hidden entrance to the ravine, so now he easily found it once again. Whistling for Dolph to follow, he snaked his way along the faint path. The hot afternoon sun was filtered by the ravine's leafy branches, but Glenn was sweating by the time he made it to the end of the canyon. There, the mountain walls opened slightly to form a small, box-shaped valley that was covered in thick brush and dotted here and there with gigantic oak trees. A A small mound rose at the far end of the hidden hollow. On it was an old building that looked like it might have been a small house at one time. But even from where Glenn stood, he could see that the roof was partially caved in, and there were only gaping holes where the windows had once been. "Cool," Glenn whispered. "Maybe it's haunted." Then, calling Dolph, he started across the valley to explore the abandoned house. Climbing from rock to rock, he made his way up the hill until he was standing right at the front door of the place. Very edgy, Dolph paced back and forth at his side, as if he smelled something suspicious. "What is it, boy?" Glenn asked. "Some kind of animal?" Glenn sniffed the air himself. He certainly couldn't smell anything. Taking a step closer, Glenn peered into the dark doorway. He motioned for Dolph to follow, but the shepherd stood where he was and whined. "What?" Glenn asked, a little irritated at his dog's behavior. Still, Dolph swung his head back and forth and refused to come any closer to the gaping doorway. Starting to grow worried by Dolph's reaction, Glenn tentatively took another step closer and stared into the small one-room building. He stood as still as a statue, readying himself to run in case some wild animal came rushing out at him. After a long moment, when nothing happened, Glenn let his breath whoosh out. "Come on, you big baby," he said, glancing back at Dolph. "There's nothing in there." To prove it to himself and to his dog, Glenn stepped through the open doorway. The interior was a mess. Debris from the collapsed roof covered half the floor, which was thick with dirt and small weeds that sprouted from the moldering pile of masonry. Now, Glenn thought he smelled something too, some kind of animal, and he figured that that must have been what his dog had smelled. Must have been something big, Glenn thought, seeing that Dolph still refused to follow him. Not bothering to enter any further, Glenn turned and went back to his dog. "You scaredy cat," he said, ruffling Dolph's neck. "I thought you were a dog, not a mouse." Obviously happy that Glenn had come back, Dolph licked him, and the two of them turned away from the hut to explore the rest of the area. But soon, Glenn realized that there was not much else of interest. So with Dolph ranging off to one side, he turned back towards the entrance of the canyon. He had not gone far when suddenly he saw a man enter the hidden valley. Stopping in surprise, Glenn quickly stepped behind a tree and watched as the man walked directly to the abandoned ruins and went inside. Overcome with curiosity, Glenn crept back towards the house. But halfway between the canyon entrance and the doorway to the house, Glenn stopped dead in his tracks. Shaking with fear, he crouched behind a large bush. Coming out of the house was an animal Glenn had only seen behind bars at the zoo. It was a gray wolf, a very large gray wolf. That house was empty, his mind insisted. I saw it myself. And then a darker thought shadowed his brain. What happened to the man who went inside the house? The wolf raised its muzzle and sniffed at the air. Glenn's fear spread through his body. It started at his legs and moved up to clutch at his chest, making it hard to keep from screaming. His breath came faster and faster, and it was as if his fear was calling to the beast. The wolf turns his head and stared in Glenn's direction. Then it lightly jumped down the rocks and disappeared into the brush. Glenn sucked in his breath and began to ease backwards from his hiding place. Then his nerve broke and he jumped up and fled, his imagination racing along with him, and he could almost hear the bushes snapping behind him and feel the hot breath of the wolf on his legs. You can see Glenn hauling ass in the opposite direction. Suddenly, there was a snarl, followed by a yelp, and the sound of thrashing. Bushes. Dolph! Glenn thought, skidding to a halt and looking behind him. But Glenn could see nothing, and all he could hear were the sounds of animals in combat, echoing, 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 off the high canyon walls. Torn by indecision, Glenn took a few steps back towards the two fighting animals. Then, with a cry of despair for his dog, he turned and ran out of the valley. Blundering along the path, ignoring the branches that grabbed at him as he pushed along, crying and cursing, Glenn fought his way through to clear land on the outside of the ravine. Once out, he staggered to a stop and peered back to the valley he had just escaped. "Off," he whispered, feeling sick at heart. He waited for a few minutes, then trudged home, making up a story to tell his parents about how Dolph had run away. He felt like such a coward that he just couldn't tell them the truth. Luckily, his tears were very convincing, and his parents sent him to bed early. Glenn glanced up at the ruins, impatient to find the site where he'd heard Dolph and the wolf fighting. Still, he had to pretend to be interested in Brandon's discovery. "Yeah," he said, trying to sound excited. "Wonder what it's doing here." "Come on," Brandon said, starting forward. "Let's go check it out." Too late to turn back now, Glenn thought, trying to shrug off his fear as he followed his friend. As they neared the house, Glenn angled himself towards where his dog had fought the wolf, and suddenly he saw something lying under a bush. Something bloody. Afraid to look, Glenn tried to calm his pounding heart as he stepped closer. Then, with a gasp, he saw that it was Dolph, lying in a blood-stained patch of torn-up earth. The poor dog was plainly dead, his throat ripped to shreds. When Glenn saw a fat fly land on one of Dolph's still-opened eyes, he broke out crying. "What is it?" Brandon asked as he came up behind Glenn. "What's wrong?" And then he looked down. "Oh," was all he could say. Glenn tried to master his grief. "It's my dog," he said, then burst out into fresh tears. Brandon stared at the dog's stiff body for a few moments. He think the same thing that killed that man killed Dolph? He murmured. Glenn nodded. I'm sure of it. Brandon stared at Dolph's bloody body for a little longer, then said quietly, "Come on, let's go." Glenn let himself be led to the ruins. I abandoned him, he wailed in his mind. Dolph was protecting me, and I ran away like a coward. Glenn spent that night endlessly reliving the events of the afternoon. The image of Dolph being torn to shreds seemed to tear at Glenn, and the guilt he felt for having left his faithful friend behind was practically unbearable. But, as guilty as Glenn was, he was equally puzzled. Try as he might, Glenn could not explain where that wolf had come from. If the man had brought it with him, Glenn was sure he would have seen it. He was also sure he would have seen something as big as a wolf the first time he looked into the abandoned house, if it had already been inside. Besides, if the ferocious-looking animal had been in there, Glenn knew it wouldn't have let him come so close. But either of those unlikely scenarios was far more possible than his deepest, darkest thought, that the man and the wolf were actually the same creature. The next morning, however, the impossible suddenly became frighteningly possible when Glenn overheard his dad's morning news program. "In local news," the announcer was saying, "the body of an unidentified male was found in the Shorthorn foothills this morning by a group of hikers. Apparently, the man died as a result of blood loss from wounds inflicted to his arms and neck. Doctors say the wounds closely resemble those caused by dog bites and are cautioning residents in the area to be on the lookout for any stray dogs that are behaving oddly." Glenn couldn't hear the rest of the broadcast over the roaring in his ears from his own raging thoughts. "No! Werewolves don't exist!" his mind screamed. "The announcer just confirmed that the man I saw going into the house was just a victim of the wolf, not the wolf itself." Still, even if that were the case, Glenn now had to answer his questions about Dolph before he went crazy with guilt. Maybe Dolph was alive and he could save him. But how? He was too scared to return to the valley alone. What if the wolf was still running loose? With no idea of what to do, Glenn decided to go over to his friend Brandon's house. Maybe he would have some ideas. As he approached his friend's two-story home at the end of the block, Glenn saw Brandon coming up the sidewalk towards him. "Sorry to hear about Dolph," Brandon called as he got closer. "That's odd," Glenn thought. "I haven't told anyone but my parents about Dolph." "How did you know?" Glenn called back. Brandon ignored the question as he walked up to meet Glenn. He had an excited gleam in his eye. "Did you hear about the guy they found this morning?" "Yeah," Glenn answered. "Sounds like he got attacked by a dog or something." "I know," Brandon went on, the excitement in his eyes turning mischievous. "I'm going to go up there and have a look around. Want to come along? Maybe we could trap the dog and become heroes." Glenn smiled. His problem was solved. Now he wouldn't have to go to the canyon alone. "Yeah, sure," he said casually, feeling a twinge of guilt for not telling Brandon what happened there the day before. Brandon didn't seem to have any clear idea of where to go, and Glenn had no problem subtly guiding him towards the canyon entrance. As they walked along the trail, Glenn noticed that it was dark and overgrown as before, with no signs of the terrified flight through the brushes yesterday afternoon that he had taken. "I wonder where this path goes," Brandon said as he followed Glenn along the trail. "I don't know," Glenn lied. "Maybe it's some kind of animal trail." As they approached the hidden valley, Glenn looked around cautiously, half expecting the gray wolf to come leaping out at him. He tried not to let Brandon see how scared he was, but by the time they reached the open end of the canyon, even though they hadn't encountered anything more threatening than a patch of poison oak, Glenn was trembling from head to toe. "Look at that," Brandon exclaimed, too interested in the expedition to notice Glenn's fear. "It's an abandoned house." Still weeping with guilt, Glenn hardly noticed as he and Brandon reached the dark doorway. Brandon ducked inside first, and Glenn blindly followed. Then, as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown at him, shock snapped Glenn out of his depression. There, standing in the house, were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, and Brandon was standing with them. All of them, Brandon included, were staring at Glenn with hatred burning in their eyes. "What's going on?" Glenn asked, looking at the boy he thought was his friend. "Brandon?" he said, his voice rising in panic. "What's going on?" "Your stupid dog killed one of us," Brandon answered angrily. "So we killed him." "What were you doing up here in the first place, you idiot?" I don't know," Glenn stammered. "Dolph and we were just exploring. If I'd known that the men remember..." The words failed Glenn as he realized that he had no idea of any connection between Brandon and these people, and the man he had seen yesterday. As Glenn tried to figure out whether or not he should run, Brandon and the others huddled together in a corner of a dilapidated room, obviously deciding his fate. Finally, the oldest of the group nodded, and Brandon produced a thermos from a pile of water. Unscrewing the lid, he took a long swallow, then passed it to the young woman next to him. She swallowed and passed it on. This was repeated until the entire group had drunk from the thermos. Brandon then pulled a different thermos from another pile of debris and handed it to Glenn. "Here," he ordered. "Drink this." Cautiously, Glenn took the container, unscrewed the lid, and sniffed. It smelled faintly sweet, like fruit juice. "What is it?" he asked. "We use it to help us with our transformations," Brandon said. "Drink some. It'll be fun." Then an evil smile crept onto Brandon's face. "Besides, you have no choice." Suddenly, Glenn understood. Dolph had killed one of the members of their clan, and now he, Glenn, was going to have to be a replacement for that lost member, whether he wanted to join their band or not. "But I don't know if he began. "You see, I'm not sure if..." "Drink!" the other shouted. Seeing that he truly had no choice, Glenn took a sip. Finish it, Brandon said flatly. Now. And so, Glenn drained the thermos to the last drop. There, he said angrily, handed the thermos back to Brandon. Now what? Am I going to grow fangs and start? But suddenly, the room began to spin. What's happening? Glenn mumbled through numbed lips as he heard the others chanting in a strange language. To his horror, he saw their bodies melt. They seemed to flow into different shapes, just as his own body was rearranging itself under his skin. Then, all at once, Glenn found himself looking at a group of wolves sitting in a circle around him, panting hungrily as saliva trailed from their open jaws. Am I a wolf too? He asked himself, quickly looking down at his body. And then he realized that he had made the worst mistake of his life. You don't want me to join you, do you? Glenn whispered to the wolves surrounding him. Sure we do, answered one wolf in Brandon's voice. We want you to join us for dinner. Only, I'm the dinner. Glenn finished the sentence for him, his soft white fur trembling, awaiting his fate as a defenseless white rabbit trapped by a circle of hungry wolves. The end of story 1. Stay